But let me ask you, before we dive into the substance, I mean, you've had an enormous impact on corporations over the course of the last year. How did you get here? How did you get into, I mean, you were in the entertainment business. Why take on corporate America?
Well, it kind of goes to the root of why I shifted my filmmaking focus to activism as well. And it's my family came from Cuba, so they lost effectively everything that they ever loved and had, aside from their existing family members that were able to come here as well, to communism. And so there's a lot of deeply rooted theory that ties together what happened in Cuba to what I see intrinsically tied within what I've referred to as woke policy and DEI. Obviously, that is a reference to DEI in practice versus in theory, because those are two totally different things. And so what we've focused on is going after DEI in reality and the ways that it's played out and actually resulted in dividing people. When the theory was that this was supposed to be beneficial and unite people and be something that builds, camaraderie among teams, that simply is not what has happened in many companies.
Yeah, so when you see those polling results, 3/4 of the people, you got a very experienced group of executives in this room, right? Decades of experience, CFOs of major companies. 3/4 of them think that they should have diversity policies. That's not to say that some of the policies didn't go too far. It's not to say that some of them didn't work.
Yeah.
But the majority of people in this room think diversity and inclusion policies are a good thing. Do you agree with them or disagree with them?
I was actually quite pleased with the poll results, to be perfectly honest, and it's because I know that there is, in the corporate world, a certain sort of ideological conformity that has existed, I think, always, because you're around each other all the time and you read a lot of the same sources, do a lot of the same things, go to a lot of the same events. And so there's also a monoculture, like when you go into the university system where a lot of people come through business school, and a lot of pressures to believe certain things. But I would say, for the group that is in that, 72%, I think it was, it ended at, that believe that they should have some diversity policies. I think for a good chunk of those people, I could bring it back to the belief that, the path to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So I believe there's good intentions on the part of a large chunk of those people. And they're just divorced from the reality of how DEI has played out for the average worker in a company. And also what it means to the average American at this point. There's a reason why there is such energy and momentum against this. So even if you don't agree with me.
But let me just go into that for a second, because you're dealing with CFOs here.
Yeah.
They live in a very metricized world. I've had conversations with many of them. They believe in this because they believe it's good for the business.
Yeah.
That's what they tell me, and they have the numbers to back it up. If they have the numbers to back it up, highly experienced, successful executives, why would you go against them?
So there's a number of different questions fused all in there. So you could refer back to where a lot of this came from, which was that McKinsey study in 2015, where a lot of companies got the idea that you could be rich by embracing these, policy ideals.
I don't think that's true.
That I've heard it time and time again.
It came from. I know the study you're talking about.
Yeah, I've heard it time and time again from executives, and Wall Street Journal was the one who actually debunked the study because it was totally false. It was this idea that you'd be rich if you did this. Now, if you talk about metrics, you have to ask yourself why some of the largest corporations in existence globally are turning away from this when we approach them and engage them. It's because they do see internal metrics, they do see financial metrics telling them that there is a negative to sticking with this. So it kind of goes into what I was about to say. If you think about this just from the vantage point that if you had the best intentions and you said the goal is to bring people together, well, the chief metric you should look at is how many of your employees don't want this anymore. If it's higher than 15%, you have a problem on your hands, because what you're doing is dividing employees by forcing this continually. And that's at the core of what I've tried to communicate to companies, that there's a lane here where you can bring people together, but it's not going to be done through DEI, which has been used, I think, really universally as a Trojan horse for
fair point.
Democrat
Employee
policies.
polls have become a standard practice within companies. I'm curious from this crowd, how many of you have pulsed your employees on whether they favor or oppose your DEI practices? a couple I see.
Not many. Yeah. But this goes back to, again, if you're talking about metrics, what's one of the chief careers where they're supposed to focus on metrics? It's pollsters, right? And we've all seen in recent times how wrong pollsters have been. So there's the energy of Americans and sort of where we see their foot traffic and things like that going, and then there's, different metrics where you can think certain things, but it's almost like the shy Trump voter that there was. There's people who don't want to talk about this at work because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And this is at the executive level. This is even CFOs that are at some of the biggest companies where they feel afraid to address this topic because there's the end result where they realize they're going to become a social pariah if they even step their foot into this. And I think that's one thing we've effectively peeled back. We've begun to make those conversations normal again. And I think it has awakened some executives to some of the policies that have happened right under their nose that they didn't even realize were happening.
But you still, when you hear, you're taking on now, you started with Tractor Supply.
John Deere.
Right. You're now taking on Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan, the most successful bank in the world, who believes he's doing the right thing. He's doing something good for his business. On what basis are you telling him he's wrong?
Well, it's interesting what happened there. He was at Davos and he goes on Squawk Box and, it gets brought up by Squawk Box, how are you going to address this Robby Starbuck guy? And he says, bring it on. And so I went on to Squawk Box, I think it was 24 hours later, and to their credit on CNBC, they let me just go through and hold up all the different policies of JP Morgan, and what I heard back, and I can't go too deeply into it because we offer off the record, agreements to people, but there's certain things I can say. And so one of them is, there was a level of unawareness of what they were actually funding. And when I went on TV and I showed those policies of funding things like the talk for Dylan Mulvaney to talk to, quote, LGBTQ plus youth, there were a lot of people inside there at a very high level who did not know these things were going on.
So your information is coming from employees?
Yes, directly from employees. And these are documents that are irrefutable, and they know that. If I was putting anything out there that wasn't real, I'd be sued 20 times over, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just not happening. We vet these things thoroughly. And so when we put it out there, what happened directly after, and I went through a long thing, it was 15 minutes of me just going through policies, right? It was a couple days later, they have the town hall where Jamie comes up, and this is right after championing DEI, and he says, we are going to stop funding, quote, this stupid. He found out about it, through that interview, and I think that's not an anomaly, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Executives we speak to over and over and over again on these off-the-record chats, they are unaware of the stuff we're bringing them, and that's a problem.
Well, so let's get back to that fundamental question then. Is your campaign designed to get rid of the stupid stuff that's happening in the name of these programs, or is your campaign to get rid of the programs? Because I think everybody in this room would probably agree there's been a lot of stupid stuff that has happened in the name of...
Yeah, I was quoting him. I wouldn't personally... I'd say stupid stuff too. Yeah. I would put it this way. I think one of the biggest problems with DEI is one where I say DEI and some people hear the word black. I say DEI, they hear black, and it's like, no, I said DEI, and they say, no, you said black. And they think I'm talking about a specific race of people or something. I'm talking about a set of policies that have hurt a lot of people, including black workers, including Latino workers. I myself, I'm Latino, so I'm not a stranger to the reality that my own kids benefit from being able to check a box that says Latino if they go and they apply to a school. And this is even after the Supreme Court decision. They benefit if a company is going out there and doing a diversity program for apprenticeship or internship, and it's only for Latinos. And do I think that's okay? That's what I have to ask myself in the mirror. I don't think it's okay. I think it's patently racist.
Okay, so let's get back to why all of this started in the first place. I mean, we've now had decades of studies that show, for instance, the resume studies. If at the top of the resume it says Jane instead of Joe or John, or even more if it says Jamal instead of Joe or John, the callback, even if it's the exact same resume, far fewer callbacks. Claudia Golden won a Nobel Prize for the studies that showed that if you do blind auditions for orchestras, you'll get 50% more women in your orchestra. So the approach the approach that you're pushing towards is not a meritocracy. I mean, we have tons of evidence of that.
It definitely is. It definitely is a meritocracy that I'm pushing for, and I think it'll work. Fundamentally, we are a different country today than we were 20 years ago. So the study everybody refers to was done 20 years ago. It's not a study.
No, many of those studies have been done.
Yeah, no, I'm going to get to the recent ones. So if you get to the one 20 years ago where this all started, and it is the one most dynamically talked about, it was actually two left-wing economists who focused on two Democrat cities, Boston and Chicago. And if you look through their methodology, there was none. There was no they literally called and answered job things from the paper. And they made up different, backgrounds and things like that. And then they invented, sort of like,
but it's been
this
repeated over and over.
And we'll get to that. The UC Berkeley one is the most recent one, okay? Which again, a left-wing source. So you can't say this is, me cherry-picking stuff. UC Berkeley goes back and looks at this. And the worst thing they could come up with is they say there might be a 7% differential between the callbacks to this and this. But dive deeper into it. Read what they actually did. Because if you do, what you're going to find is they saw the vast majority of companies had equal callbacks to black and white employee or prospective employees. So equal callbacks from the vast majority of the companies. And then if you look...
Who said no over here?
Over there.
So that is what it says. You can pull it up right now.
You keep quoting statistics and reports, but people have their lived experience.
Yeah.
Racism isn't a blind experience in America. We have a whole history. You talk about the history of your family coming from Cuba. Well, the history of racism in America and what it does to people, our own lived experiences, sitting in a room while it's, we now have a seat at the table. We sit in a room and watch the selection processes play out. Our kids now have the entitlement, and we see that when we walk into the room of the private schools and the private programs and the amount of money that people spend on college admissions compared to those who don't have that money, it is not a meritocracy. It's our lived experience. We don't even need the report. I'm a black man in America. I live it. My kids live it. My grandkids live it. My parents lived it. So I don't understand why you think you're taking us back to something that's more equal when you remove everything that's meant to create the equality.
Well, nothing we're doing is going back anywhere, but you were...
And go back to your point, and no, nothing's changed from 20 years ago, not from my lived experience.
Well, that's just ludicrous. I mean, statistically,
why
everything's
is it ludicrous
changed.
when it's, you keep saying that
your anecdotal experience is not the totality of the general public. So
but
you
it doesn't matter. Your generalized statements about DEI programs does not apply to everyone. Maybe it's working in some instances. Maybe it's working at my company. Maybe it didn't work at whatever. But we fund all types of silly programs. We have programs that give people entitlements to country clubs, to first class seats, to business lounges.
I appreciate.
So that's not a meritocracy, is all I'm saying.
I appreciate the question. In other words, he just agreed. We have all kinds of silly programs out there.
There are a lot of silly programs.
But we also have what I think most people in this room who answered that poll think is a legitimate problem that needs to be addressed. So why don't we find the programs that work?
Yes. So this is the study. What is that in the middle there? The vast majority. I don't know what study. This is the UC Berkeley study. That's the vast majority of companies. Y'all can see it. They're in the middle, blue dots. Those are companies that were doing pretty much equal callbacks to black and white applicants. Okay, so everybody's entitled to their anecdotal individual experience, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Those are the facts. And you know what else that study found? They found there was a group of companies, about a dozen of them, who did unequal callbacks and at a vastly higher clip called back black applicants over white applicants. So clearly, you can make anecdotal arguments that there's companies that misbehave, but it goes both directions.
Let's go at this from another direction. If you look at the statistics, this is a group of CFOs, right?
Yeah.
S&P 500, only 18% of CFOs are women. Do you think that reflects meritocracy? Do you think there's any possibility that there's some unconscious, implicit bias in that result? And similarly, if you look at CEOs, among the Fortune 500, only 10% of CEOs today, and you can get the numbers for blacks as well, but only 10% of CEOs are women. Is that a meritocratic result, or are there institutional factors based on a history where once, it wasn't that long ago that women didn't have the opportunity to take these jobs? Do we still have implicit biases in the system that are leading to that result?
I really don't believe we do at a sizable level. Does it exist in anecdotal individual senses where it can happen? Yeah, all over the world, always has, always will. I would say a lot of what that actually where you find a responsibility there is actually in the biological differences between men and women. Women are more likely to make different choices than men. We see that across all economic data where they choose to have different jobs. Women are more likely to choose jobs that are empathetic, like nurses, school teachers. Men are more likely, if you look
Not
at
CFOs. CFOs aren't empathetic.
No, we're going to get into the CFO and executive level, but no, just on a general basis in terms of biological differences, that's what you see. If you see the most dangerous jobs out there, you're going to find it's almost exclusively male. And so that speaks to a larger pattern we see biologically. Men and women make different choices. Women are much more likely to make sacrifices for their family, and I would actually argue they're making a good choice in a lot of those cases. They make wiser choices for their mental health and for their physical health than men typically do. Maybe that's why they live longer. But they choose the track of becoming a CEO less often or a CFO less often than a male does. Now, what's chiefly responsible for that? Duke did a study where they looked at this. They found women were more likely to believe certain things about themselves or about their job that led to them advancing less often than men. So for instance, males were polled and they were much more likely to leave a company if they felt like it could advance their career, whereas women were much more loyal to their job. And so what you see is in terms of the actual biological differences, you're going to see different outcomes.
You're cherry-picking studies. I mean, there are, again, lots of recent studies that show that there's affinity bias in hiring, that people tend to hire people who are like themselves.
Who does the studies?
Researchers, companies. A lot of people in this room have probably done those studies on their own employees.
So if you have a DEI department and an HR department that are intrinsically fused together, and you believe there's affinity bias and there's an ideological monoculture, what do you think is going to happen in hiring?
What is an ideological monoculture?
They all believe the same thing. They all vote for the same thing. They all are
but why
part and parcel
would you,
of the same
again,
ideological belief system.
How can you tell the people sitting in this room who represent large companies that they're all part of some sort of woke ideology?
Well, I don't think we're going to get hands up.
How do you even define that?
I don't think we're going to get hands up for this question, but I think if you ask people in this room across your life, if you voted more often for Democrats than Republicans, you're going to find the vast majority of them vote more often for Democrats.
Oh, I'll bet that's not the case. I'm not going to do the experiment. I'm not going to put people on the spot, but these are CFOs of large companies. They've been affiliated with Republicans most of their career.
Yeah, I don't think most of them would argue with the reality that the executive class has veered left pretty hard over the last 15 years.
I've spent a lot of time on this over the last 10 years. What I can tell you is that the executive class is less uniformly aligned with the Republican Party than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, vastly so.
But I don't think there's any evidence that it has veered left or that it is more aligned with the Democratic Party.
I would say there's actually a ton of evidence, and I think Wall Street Journal actually has covered this in some ways.
I've got the polls, but we can put that aside. Why don't you tell us where you've been successful with this, you've made a real impact. Where are you going next?
Well, we're going to continue.
Even before you even do that, how do you choose your targets? Like why do you go after the most successful bank in the world? How do you, or Walmart, what is your beef against Walmart? How do you choose those targets?
Well, so we planned this out actually pretty far out from the very beginning, and I knew that essentially a lot of the crazy stuff had entered after George Floyd. There was a lot of pressure put on executives to invest more in DEI, and what happened was, again, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There was an intent to try to bring people together on the executive level in many cases, right? I don't think there's a bunch of true believers out there that wanted this to be, a political activism thing. But then people who ran the departments were political activists in many cases. And so these things got misused. And we knew if the Overton window shifted so broadly left so quickly, that for us to get back there, we needed to start with companies that depended on right-wing consumers. So that's where we started.
So it wasn't that these companies had the worst policies.
No, not at all.
It was that they had consumers that you could get to.
Absolutely. So they had consumers we could influence, and I knew we could influence in a really dramatic way, as people saw with Bud Light. And so I said, well, start there, and you shift the momentum over time. You start to create an environment where, it starts to feel normal, right? And then you also show the benefit of doing so. And so, some people have argued what we do has both a carrot and a stick, because if you look at the financial performance, while we're focusing on a company like Tractor Supply lost almost $3 billion in market cap, John Deere over $10 billion, and so on and so forth. Harley Davidson, I'm not sure how long they'll survive in their condition, because they held out the longest, and their consumers have punished them for that. So if you look at that, and then you look at the market performance of companies after we make the announcement that they change, you see that universally, with the exception of Harley Davidson, the market rewards them. The market's rewarding companies dropping this stuff. So there's a reason for that. Again, and it's not just the fact that, you've got this new political environment where we are ascendant on the right, but it's also the reality of the financials here, because I'm not trying to get companies to be a mirror of my political beliefs, because all that's going to do is trap corporate America into a cycle where every 4 years you're a hostage, essentially, of whichever political party is ascendant, right?
But so what are you trying to get them to do?
To get to neutral. Because we want them long-term to be able to have customers on both sides, have employees on both sides, and be able to get out of the division. To do that, you effectively have to reject the divisive policies and reject the politics being forced into the workplace.
Again, I've talked to hundreds of CEOs about this over the course of the last decade, and they almost never talk about political forces, and most of them, particularly the best ones, say that they do this because it makes their company stronger, that a diverse workforce has, in their experience, and I'm not talking about any particular study or McKinsey study, I haven't heard any of them mention the McKinsey study, but that they, from their own experience, they find that being surrounded by diverse backgrounds and diverse voices actually makes them a stronger company. That's how you get innovation. That's how you get resilience. Are they wrong?
I would say this: the proof is in what executives are doing in response to our campaigns. Why do they keep relenting? If it's truly that beneficial to your business, why? But tons of people attack companies. They don't relent to their position. Short sellers do this all the time. They attack companies, and then the company says, no, you're wrong.
There was a recent study by the Pew Research Center that shows that more than 50% of workers today, this is not 20 years ago, today, favored company DEI policies, and only about 25% oppose them.
Okay.
So you're talking about an active minority of their employees.
So again, you go back to what was the intention of DEI? Is it to bring people together or not? To have a unified workplace?
No, the intention of DEI was to build stronger companies by getting diverse voices involved in the management of those companies.
It certainly wasn't to inject division where 25% or up to 50% at some companies of their workforce.
But I think a lot of people in this argument would say that you're the one who's injecting the division.
Well, so you'd have to look at what policies am I advocating for. I'm advocating for a neutral lane, not one where there's any racism involved or anything like that. In fact, I'm actually saying we need to go out and enforce our existing civil rights laws. Look at, why do we have DEI? DEI, in intention, the way you speak it, would be to ensure that there's no racism in hiring or firing, right? That everybody sort of has equal opportunity, not equal outcome. Well, that's immediately kind of blown up by the word equity, right? Which means equal outcome, not equal opportunity. And so if companies are trying to get equal outcomes for people, essentially what you're doing is you're creating a system and a culture where you make your company and their policy set, DEI, including equity, the enemy of excellence. Because what happens if you're taking an excellent employee base here and you say, actually, this other group that's not performing as well, we're going to artificially boost them up here. What is the incentive for the excellent people to continue to be excellent?
We could do this all afternoon. We're not going to do it all afternoon, but I want to go back to the basic point, because I think this is really important. You can make an argument against the word equity, and a lot of companies have dropped, and you've played a role in this, dropped the word equity from their diversity plans. But I guess my question is, at the end of the day, are you trying to get towards more reasonable policies that promote diversity and inclusion within companies, or are you trying to get it out of there altogether?
So you have to define what diversity and inclusion means, right? Because if you were an employee at John Deere, what you were faced with, if you say you were Jewish or you were Christian or you were Muslim, and your boss came to you and said, hey, I want you to sign this ally pledge. You're pitted into a position where you understand your performance bonus, your ability to advance in your job, is predicated in large part on your DEI performance. And so you know that if you say no, you're not only putting your job at risk, your promotion at risk, all those things, but since this is public, you're actually making it possible that you become a social pariah in the workplace. And so you have to, ask yourself, am I going to go and violate my deeply held faith, or am I going to sign this thing? Now, that employee who's put in that position never would have been rude to an employee, a fellow employee who happened to be gay or whatever it might be, but what place does a work have injecting those situations? And my argument, and I think the consumer argument that's being made, is that they really don't have a place doing that, and we don't want to give our money to companies who do that.
You're against any policy that's designed to counter unconscious bias, implicit bias. You don't believe it exists.
See, so what I believe is we need to enforce our existing civil rights laws.
We can't keep going all afternoon. I'm just trying to get to a yes or no.
We need to enforce existing civil rights law. If there is a black person who is being discriminated against, we absolutely need to make sure that's not happening. That's something that is already in the law. So the creation of an extra policy set when we already have laws in this country and have for a very long time.
But if you're an executive who believes your company will do better in the marketplace if you put in place policies to ensure that you have a diverse workforce, you're okay with that?
So I would ask this. Why is it that every time I knock on their door, they drop the policy?
Well, they don't want to have nuisance lawsuits. They don't want to have an investigation from. By the way, this is an important question because some of this is being driven by the administration. Are you working with the administration?
I have a lot of friends in the administration.
So you talk to them regularly?
I won't join the administration or anything like that, but I have a lot of friends in it. And I think that, you can see in the language, it's a lot of the same language I've been using for a long time. Yeah. And then you see it now out of the agencies.
Last question. Where are you going next?
We're going to stay focused on this. Another area, we've crossed this point where we no longer need to ideologically stick ourselves and say, we've only got to focus on these companies with right-wing consumers. We crossed that a long time ago. So our focus is on the broadest change possible. We'll continue to announce companies. In fact, there'll be some in this coming, week and next 2 weeks, I think a number of them. Companies, we've given them a lot of good advice, I think, and you look at sort of intent, right? If you look at our intent, we're not shaking companies down. We're not asking for money. We're not doing anything like that. We're not saying, hey, hire us as advisors or anything like that. But our goal is to get to that place where corporate neutrality is the norm at all these companies, and they stay out of divisive policy, and they stick to doing what they do best. Yeah. And you're going to have a more united workplace as a byproduct of that. So we can all agree on a few things, and I think this is the argument I would make. Adopt fairness, expectations with your employees around kindness, be kind to your fellow employees. Use language like that is universally accepted. And have a strict line where you fire employees who cross those lines. Okay, so if somebody comes into work and they wage into some horrific, racist diatribe, fire them. Yeah. But that just doesn't happen on a regular basis.